When we think of blue skin, we immediately think of a medical emergency. Maybe this person isn't getting enough oxygen. Maybe their lungs are failing, maybe their heart is about to give out. But for one family in the Appalachian Mountains, blue skin wasn't a medical crisis. It wasn't even a mystery. For them, it was just life, their reality. And nobody really questioned it for more than 100 years. I know, it sounds like some kind of fairy tale gone wrong. A mountain family cursed with skin the color of indigo, hiding away in the forested hills of Kentucky. But this isn't a fable, and it isn't a horror novel, it's true. Well, hello there, I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and He. Today we're going to talk about the Fuggets of troublesome Creek America's most infamous family of blue people. Their story is one of isolation, secrets, inbreeding, and science. It's the kind of story that starts out sounding almost whimsical, like a small-town legend, but the deeper you go, the darker and more unsettling it becomes. So, let's begin. The beginning. Martin Fagate. The story starts with one man, Martin Fagate. Martin was born in France sometime in the late 1700s. Not much is known about his early life except for one thing, the rumors. Stories passed down through generations whisper that Martin himself may have been blue. Was he? We don't know for certain. Some say yes, that his parents abandoned him because they didn't know how to raise a child with skin the color of slate. Others say it's just folklore, the kind of story you invent when you're trying to explain the unexplainable. What we do know is that Martin eventually migrated to the United States. In the early 1800s, the government was eager to get settlers into the wild, untamed lands of Kentucky. They offered up plots of land to anyone willing to homestead. And so, in 1820, Martin accepted the offer. He made his way into the eastern Kentucky wilderness and settled on a stretch of land along a twisting, winding waterway called Troublesome Creek. The land was beautiful but unforgiving. Dense forests, steep hills, and rough trails made it hard to get in or out. Life there required grit and resilience. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted crowds of settlers, which is exactly how Martin liked it. Elizabeth Smith, the pale bride soon after settling in. Martin met a woman named Elizabeth Smith. Elizabeth was known for her fiery red hair and skin as pale as a ghost. People said she was as white as the mountain laurel that bloomed in the hollows each spring. When Martin and Elizabeth married, the locals may have seen them as an odd pair, him rumored to be strange, her with her ghostly complexion. But love doesn't care about appearances, and together they began a family. That's when the legend of the blue people really began. Their first child was born with skin that wasn't pink or pale, but blue. Not frostbitten blue, not dying blue. Just blue, the shock that wasn't now. Let me pause for a second. Imagine being a frontier couple in the 1820s. You've just had your first baby. You expect that baby to look like, well, a baby, and instead you're handed a child the color of a stormy sky. Personally, I think I would have panicked, wouldn't you? But according to the family stories, Martin and Elizabeth didn't. Maybe it was because they had already heard whispers about Martin's own mysterious childhood. Maybe Martin had been blue once too, and no one spoke about it. Or maybe, in the isolation of Troublesome Creek, they simply accepted it as fate. What we do know is that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. Martin and Elizabeth had 7 children. 4 of them were born blue. A recessive curse. It turns out Martin and Elizabeth shared a rare recessive gene. When one parent carries it, it doesn't usually show. But when both parents carry it and pass it down together, you get blue skin. The condition is called methemoglobinemia. In simple terms, it means the blood can't carry oxygen as efficiently. Instead of glowing red when oxygenated, the blood looks darker, giving the skin a bluish tint. It's incredibly rare, so rare that the chances of 2 carriers finding each other are astronomically slim. And yet, by pure coincidence, Martin and Elizabeth did. This was the beginning of a dynasty of blue children in Kentucky. The trap of Troublesome Creek now. You might think this little oddity of genetics would have faded away after Martin and Elizabeth's kids grew up. After all, what are the chances of them marrying other carriers? That's where geography and fate conspired to make things much, much worse. See, Troublesome Creek wasn't just a name. It described the land itself. The trails were nearly impassable, tangled with thick trees, stones, and vines. Outsiders rarely made it in. Settlers rarely made it out. The Fugates weren't alone in this valley, but there weren't many other families either. Just a handful: the Smiths, the Coles, the Stacys, and the Richies. That's it. 5 families in total, including the Fugates. Which meant that when the children of these families grew up and wanted to marry, their options were limited. Very limited, the inbreeding, and so it began. Martin and Elizabeth's son Zachariah married his own Aunt Elizabeth's sister. Yeah, you heard that right. Aunt and nephew. Together they had 8 children. And those children married their cousins. And their children married back into the same families again and again. The family tree didn't branch outward. It folded in on itself, curling tighter and tighter until it looked less like a tree and more like a pole shooting straight up. And with each new generation, more blue children were born. Shades of blue. Not everyone was the same shade. Some looked almost normal, so pale they had a bluish cast, as if their veins were showing through paper-thin skin. Others were unmistakably blue, their skin tinted like cobalt or indigo. But whether faint or vivid, the Fugates couldn't hide it. Their neighbors might have been used to it, but whenever strangers stumbled into Troublesome Creek, they were shocked. Imagine walking into a remote hollow and being greeted by a family that looked like they'd stepped out of a fantasy novel or a nightmare. It wasn't long before the Fugates began to feel the weight of their difference. They became embarrassed, withdrawn, secretive. Their blue skin, once just a quirk of fate, became a brand of shame. And as whispers spread that their blueness was the result of inbreeding, they isolated even further. They stopped mingling with their neighbors. They stuck to themselves. And so the cycle repeated, stronger than ever. 100 years of blue. This went on not for decades, but for over a century. 150 years of blue babies being born, of cousins marrying cousins, of shame and secrecy tucked away in the hills of eastern Kentucky. The outside world barely knew they existed, but inside the valley people whispered theories. Some thought the Fugates' blood was too close to the skin. Others suspected a disease of the lungs or heart. None of it made sense. After all, the blue Fugates weren't frail. They lived long lives, 80, even 90 years. They weren't weak or dying. They were just blue. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. Because blue skin wasn't supposed to be normal, but for the Fugates, it was. The devil's work now. Remember, this was the 1800s, early 1900s. People didn't trust what they couldn't understand. And when something couldn't be explained, it was usually blamed on the devil. Neighbors muttered that blue skin was unnatural, a mark of evil. Some swore the Fugates were cursed. Others whispered that their blueness came from sin, that God was punishing them for their inbreeding. And so the Fugates hid deeper in the hollows. They avoided outsiders. They avoided stares. They became shadows of the hills, seen only rarely, always sparking rumors when they appeared. The world takes notice. For nearly 150 years, the secret stayed tucked away in Troublesome Creek, but eventually, in the mid-20th century, word began to spread. By the 1960s, whispers of Blue Hill people reached the ears of doctors and scientists. And that's when things really got interesting. Because soon, a determined hematologist and a curious nurse would go on what they jokingly called a Smurf hunt, a journey deep into the Kentucky hills to uncover the truth of the blue Fugates. And what they found would shock not only the medical community, but the entire nation. By the mid-20th century, the Fugates of Troublesome Creek were little more than a rumor to the outside world. A whispered legend passed between doctors and nurses, a strange tale of blue people hidden deep in the hills of Kentucky. Most wrote it off as tall talk. But for a handful of curious minds, the whispers were too strange to ignore. That's how 2 unlikely figures came together, one a nurse, the other a hematologist, and set out to solve a mystery that had haunted a single family for generations. The nurse and the blue woman. The first was Ruth Pendergrass, a nurse working at a small rural clinic in eastern Kentucky. One morning, a woman walked through her door. Nothing unusual about that, except the woman's skin was blue. Not pale, not bruised blue. Ruth froze. She was certain this woman was on the verge of death. Maybe a heart attack. Maybe her lungs were failing. Whatever it was, Ruth thought she was about to watch her patient collapse. But the woman wasn't gasping for air. She wasn't weak. She wasn't even worried. In fact, she seemed more surprised by Ruth's reaction than Ruth was by her skin. When Ruth asked what was happening, the woman smiled faintly and said, "Oh, honey, you must not know. My family, we're the Blue Combs. My sister married into the Fuggets." Ruth was stunned. A family? Not just one? An entire family of blue people? The woman assured her this was normal for them. But Ruth couldn't let it go. She needed answers. Enter Dr. Madison Cawein. That's when Ruth turned to Dr. Madison Cawein too, a hematologist at the University of Kentucky. Cawein was no ordinary doctor. He had already built a reputation for himself. He'd helped isolate the antidote for cholera. He had played a part in developing treatments for Parkinson's disease, but his true obsession was blood. He wanted to understand it, to decode its secrets. When Ruth told him about the blue people, his curiosity ignited. This wasn't just folklore anymore. There was a living, breathing patient in his state. The thought consumed him. Who were these people? Why were they blue? Was it a disease, a mutation, or something no one had seen before? So, Cawein and Ruth joined forces. The Smurf hunt together, they set out on what they jokingly called a Smurf hunt, but the task was far from easy. The Fuggets and their kin lived in remote hollows, tucked away in the Appalachian hills. Getting there required traveling up twisting mountain paths for hours. Cawein would sometimes spend 8 hours one way, bouncing along rough roads and hiking steep trails just to reach the valley. And when he did, the blue people weren't exactly waiting with open arms. They had spent generations hiding from prying eyes, shunning outsiders, keeping their family secret to themselves. Cawein and Ruth would spot them, sometimes a flash of blue skin up on a ridge, a figure slipping into the trees. But by the time they climbed the hills, the person was gone. It was a chase, a pursuit, and sometimes it felt hopeless. But then they found them. Meeting the blue Fuggets one by one, Cawein began to meet the descendants of Martin Fugate. Some were faintly tinged with blue, as if their veins pressed through translucent skin. Others were unmistakably cobalt. Entire families, children and parents alike, carried the mark. To the outside world, they might have looked like characters from a fantasy novel. To Cawein, they were a mystery waiting to be solved. He took blood samples. He examined them. And what he found was astonishing. The science of blue. The Fuggates weren't cursed. They weren't possessed by demons. They weren't even sick. They suffered from methemoglobinemia, a genetic condition so rare that most doctors never see a single case in their careers. Here's how it works. Normally, our blood contains hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen and gives blood its red color. But in the Fuggates, an enzyme was missing, cytochrome B5 reductus. Without it, hemoglobin was converted into methemoglobin, which can't carry oxygen the same way. The result? Their blood turned a darker, chocolatey color. And when that blood flowed under their skin, it gave them a blue hue. It wasn't deadly. It didn't shorten their lives, it just made them blue. The cure. But here's the twist. Cawein discovered it could be reversed. All it took was a simple medicine, methylene blue. When injected, it turned the Fuggets' blood back to its proper red, and their skin returned to a healthy pink. It wasn't permanent. The effect would fade, and the blueness would return. But for a few hours, the Fuggates looked just like everyone else. Imagine that. Living your entire life with skin the color of indigo, only to find that one injection could erase it like magic. For Cawein, it was the breakthrough of a lifetime. For the Fuggates, it was proof that they weren't cursed at all, they were just carrying a gene. The media storm, of course. Once word got out, the media descended. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the blue people of Kentucky. Reporters painted them as curiosities, oddities, relics of mountain isolation. They were pitied, mocked, sensationalized. Some articles portrayed them as tragic victims of inbreeding, others as fascinating scientific anomalies. The Fuggates themselves? They hated the attention. For a family that had spent generations hiding, suddenly becoming a national spectacle was unbearable. The shame of blue. The Fuggates had always been embarrassed by their skin, but now it wasn't just the neighbors whispering, it was the entire country. They withdrew even further, shutting themselves off from outsiders. Some refused to be photographed. Others refused treatment. The shame was too much. One descendant recalled how children would burst into tears at the sight of a blue person. Adults would stare. Strangers would point. The Fugates weren't just battling a genetic quirk, they were battling ridicule. The persistence of the gene over time, the gene began to fade. As roads improved and travel became easier, the descendants of Troublesome Creek began marrying outside their tiny circle. With new blood came new genetics, and the chance of two carriers producing a blue child dwindled. But the gene didn't vanish. Even today, descendants of the Fugates carry it. Some still show signs. And though the family no longer lives in complete isolation, their legacy remains etched into medical history. Horror in the Hills, think about it. For more than a century, an entire family lived marked by their own blood. Blue skin, born from chance and sealed by isolation. They weren't sick, they weren't dying, they weren't dangerous. But to their neighbors, they were freaks. To the media, they were a spectacle. And to themselves, they were a secret best kept hidden in the hollows of Kentucky. The story of the Fugates isn't just about genetics. It's about shame, survival, and the ways people turn difference into monstrosity. And while science may have solved the mystery, it never erased the scars left behind. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the Fugates were no longer just a hidden rumor in the Kentucky hills. Thanks to Dr. Madison K. Wayne and Nurse Ruth Pendergrass, the Blue people had become a medical case study, a human curiosity, and much to the family's discomfort, a national headline. But what happens when a family that has spent over a century hiding is suddenly dragged into the spotlight? The answer is not relief, not joy, not even pride in their unique genetics. No, the Fugates felt exposed. The spectacle of blue when Kewayne published his findings, medical journals buzzed with fascination. Here was a rare genetic condition, practically a living experiment in heredity and isolation. Scientists from around the country wanted to know more. Doctors wanted to observe. Geneticists wanted to trace the family tree, but the media wanted a freak show. Articles popped up in major newspapers. Journalists hiked into Troublesome Creek, not with stethoscopes or microscopes, but with cameras and notepads. They wrote about the blue hillbillies with a mixture of pity and mockery. Some even painted the Fugates as relics of inbreeding gone wrong, a grotesque oddity tucked away in America's backwoods. Can you imagine? Your family, already burdened by generations of whispers and shame, suddenly turned into a nationwide punchline. The Fugates hated it. A family withdraws rather than embrace the attention. The Fugates shrank from it. Some refused to be interviewed. Some flatly denied being related to the Blue family. Others stopped venturing into town altogether, afraid of the stares, the comments, the gawking. For generations, they had survived by keeping to themselves, and now, even with science offering an explanation, the stigma was worse than ever. The association with inbreeding, the ugly truth behind their isolation, was out in the open. They weren't just blue. They were the inbred blue people, and that label was almost impossible to shake. The escape, as roads improved and outsiders moved into the region, new bloodlines entered the hills. Descendants of the Fugates began to marry beyond their tiny circle. With each generation, the gene grew weaker. The blue skin became less common, popping up only occasionally. Eventually, the condition seemed to vanish from Troublesome Creek entirely, and some Fugates seized the opportunity to escape. They moved out of the hills, away from Hazard, Kentucky, away from the shadow of Troublesome Creek. Some settled in nearby towns, others moved across the country. They took new jobs, built new lives, and when people asked about their past, many stayed quiet. The further they got from the mountains, the more their blue legacy faded into whispers. The modern descendants, but the gene never fully disappeared. Even into the late 20th century, doctors documented cases of descendants born with methemoglobinemia. One of the last well-known blue Fugates was Benjamin Benji Stacy, born in 1975. When Benji came into the world, his skin was so blue that doctors panicked, convinced he was suffocating. His parents were horrified, certain something terrible had happened. But older relatives calmed them. Don't worry. He's one of the blue Fugates, they said. Within a few days, Benji's skin lightened to a more typical shade, though his lips and fingernails would sometimes still turn blue in the cold. To outsiders, Benji was a medical marvel, the last living reminder of a strange genetic curse. To his family, he was simply a child carrying the blood of Martin and Elizabeth. Science versus stigma. By this time, the science was clear. Doctors knew exactly what caused the blueness. They knew how to treat it. They knew it wasn't dangerous, but science didn't erase the stigma. In the hills of Kentucky, whispers still lingered. People still chuckled at the idea of the blue hillbillies. The jokes, the stereotypes, the ridicule, it all persisted. The Fuggets had been branded by history. No matter how much they moved, married out, or tried to blend in, the story of their blueness followed them. The inbreeding question, and here's the part that makes people squirm. Yes, the blueness was caused by a recessive gene, but it only flourished because of generations of inbreeding. Cousins marrying cousins. Nephews marrying aunts. Families folding inward on themselves until their gene pool was a closed loop. Without that isolation, without those taboo unions, the blue children of Troublesome Creek might never have been born. It's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story, the thing people can look away from. Not just the science, not just the color of their skin, but the reminder of what happens when a family is cut off from the outside world for too long. A national obsession by the late 20th century, the Fugates had become a pop culture phenomenon. Books wrote about them. Documentaries speculated on them. Late-night comedians joked about the Blue Family of Kentucky. They were no longer just a medical curiosity, they were American folklore. And like all folklore, their story was twisted, exaggerated, sensationalized. The truth is more nuanced, more tragic. They weren't monsters. They weren't freaks. They were victims of chance, geography, and isolation. And yet, in the eyes of the world, they remained blue forever. The silence of the Fugates. Today, many descendants don't talk about it. For some, it's too painful, a reminder of a childhood filled with stares and whispers. For others, it's a shameful relic of a past they'd rather forget. If you track the family tree today, you'll still find their blood scattered across Kentucky and beyond. Some carry the gene quietly, never expressing it. Others may show faint traces. But few are willing to step forward and claim the legacy. The Fugates have tried, in every way possible, to outrun the blueness. The horror of being seen, and maybe that's the real horror of the story, not the blue skin itself, not the gene, not even the inbreeding, but the way society responded. The way a family was hounded, mocked, and exposed. The way the world turned their private reality into a grotesque spectacle. The Blue Fugates were never dangerous, never monstrous. They were just different. But difference is often the thing we fear most. For more than a century, the Fugates of Troublesome Creek lived in the shadows of their own bodies. Blue skin, born from a twist of fate and trapped by isolation, turned them into both a scientific marvel and a cultural punchline. By the late 20th century, their story had spread across the nation. Doctors had solved the mystery. Newspapers had sensationalized it. Folklore had twisted it. But the legacy of the Blue Fugates didn't end with science or headlines. It lingers in medicine, in culture, and in the unsettling questions their story leaves behind. The science they left behind, Dr. Madison K. Wayne and Nurse Ruth Pendergrass may have started their Smurf hunt with curiosity, but what they uncovered reshaped medical understanding. The Fugates helped doctors learn about methemoglobinemia not just as an isolated quirk, but as a window into how recessive genes operate in isolated populations. They showed, in the starkest way possible, what happens when a community is cut off from the outside world and forced to marry within its own bloodline. Today, when doctors diagnose rare blood disorders, when geneticists study recessive traits, the Fugates are part of that conversation. Their story isn't just folklore, it's science. But the Fugates never asked to be case studies. They never wanted to be medical celebrities. For them, blue skin was just life. It was everyone else who turned it into spectacle. The stain of shame, and that's the part people forget. Yes, there was wonder in the mystery of their condition. Yes, doctors were fascinated by the science. But for the Fugates themselves, it was a curse of shame. Imagine being a child born into a family already whispered about for inbreeding, and then realizing your very skin marks you out as different. Imagine walking into town and seeing people freeze, stare, whisper, Imagine reporters knocking on your door, calling you a freak, turning your body into a headline. Science explained the blue, but it didn't erase the humiliation. For generations, the Fugates lived not only with their genetic fate, but with the crushing weight of stigma. The last blue children. By the 1970s, the blue gene had all but faded from Troublesome Creek. Roads had opened. Outsiders had moved in, and descendants married beyond their tiny circle. The isolated bloodlines dissolved. The last well-documented case was Benjamin "Benji" Stacy, born in 1975. When he came into the world with skin so blue doctors thought he was suffocating, his family wasn't surprised. Older relatives nodded knowingly. He was a Fugate. Benji's blueness faded as he grew, lingering only in the purple tinge of his lips and nails when the cold set in. To the outside world, he was a marvel. To his family, he was proof that the legacy of Troublesome Creek still lived in their blood. But after Benji, the blue children disappeared. The gene is still out there, carried quietly by descendants scattered across Kentucky and beyond. But the era of visibly blue families in the hollows is gone. The Fugates faded back into history. The folklore machine, of course, folklore doesn't care about fading. Even today, people tell the story of the blue people of Kentucky with a mix of fascination and mockery. Documentaries dramatize it. Articles recycle the same photos. Late-night hosts still crack jokes about blue hillbillies. The Fugates have become part of America's strange mythology tucked alongside tales of moonshiners, coal miners, and Appalachian ghost stories. A family remembered less for who they were and more for what made them different. But beneath the folklore lies something darker. The blue Fugates are a reminder of how quickly society turns difference into entertainment. The horror of being human. And here's the thing, the Fugates weren't monsters. They weren't cursed. They weren't victims of divine punishment. They were just people who happened to inherit a rare gene. People trapped in a remote valley with too few neighbors. People who fell into patterns of marriage that compounded a genetic quirk into a family-wide phenomenon. They farmed. They raised children. They told stories by firelight. They lived and died in the shadow of the mountains, no different from countless other Appalachian families except for the color of their skin. And yet, because of that color, they were made into something less than human in the eyes of outsiders. A curiosity, a joke, a spectacle. That, perhaps, is the most horrifying part of their story. Not the inbreeding, not the blue skin, but the way the world refused to let them simply exist. The lesson of Troublesome Creek. So what can we take from the Fugates' story? On one level, it's a fascinating tale of genetics and isolation. A medical mystery solved. A glimpse into how recessive traits can flourish in hidden corners of the world. But on another level, it's a haunting reminder of human cruelty, the way difference becomes stigma, the way isolation breeds shame, the way families can spend generations hiding from the very society that should have offered understanding. The Fugates remind us that science can solve mysteries, but it can't heal wounds carved by ridicule. The Blue Legacy. Today, Troublesome Creek is just another name on a Kentucky map. The hollows still stand, the forests still crowd the hillsides, but the blue people are gone. And yet their legacy remains etched into medicine, folklore, and the unsettling corners of American history. The Fugates will always be remembered as the Blue family. But perhaps the real story isn't about the color of their skin at all. Perhaps it's about the weight of being different in a world that punishes difference. For over a century, the Fugates lived in isolation, bound by blood, marked by blue. Their story may be strange. It may even be horrifying. But above all, it is human. And maybe that's the lesson we should carry, that behind every rumor, every whisper, every cruel joke, there are people, flesh, and blood, dreams and fears who never asked to be turned into legends. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.